This is not wine, just so everybody knows. Why did you have to tell us? That song, when I hear that song, two things. First of all, I realize, because I've been with you all now for 5+ years, and I'm still getting to know a lot of you better and better, but I know a lot of you already, and some of you know me well. And to hear this song takes on a whole new meaning. Hard times come again no more, because I know what a lot of us are dealing with on a regular basis, and I can imagine what others of us who I don't know as well but are dealing with. If we just asked for a show of hands, if we ourselves aren't in the midst of hard times, have we not experienced them, or do we not know somebody going through them? Are we not living in a culture in which we are immersed in this notion of life is really getting hard these days? So the song speaks to that aspect of what it means to be human. And I thought about asking that question early on and just letting you think about this idea of what it means to be human. There's a great video online. It's a 2-part video, a couple hours worth. It's just called Human, the documentary. But I thought maybe I'd get some answers. And so I watched it for the first hour. And by the middle of it, I was just speeding through it, because it was just one person after another talking about what they thought being a human meant. And a lot of it had to do with their hardships, and a lot of it had to do with their hope, and their reaching out to one another, and just kind of the connectivity of what it means to be human among other humans, or perhaps human in the midst of our natural and ecological life. So it was interesting, and then I got online and I looked for a scientific description, and then that got confusing. If you go to Psychology Today, there's an article a couple of years ago where a scientist tries to explain it and says, well, that's not exactly clear what it means to be human. Because Homo sapiens, for some, Homo sapiens sapiens is a new way of thinking about it. We're not even sure how far we've evolved from the last branch of who we are, and how does this distinguish us from other levels of primates. Just what is it that makes us distinctive? And at the end, the answer the scientist came up was a theological answer. Basically, we live in the midst of trying to figure out who we are, and we live in the midst of this ambiguity and mystery. And maybe that's what makes us uniquely human. And I thought, well, the guy's gone to seminary, because that's kind of how we ended up with what we understand ourselves to be. We live in the midst of this mystery and in the midst of hardship. What does it mean to be human? Now, I can say that for years, I pastored a church for about 10, I was associate pastor at churches and then pastored a church over a period of about 10 years. And then I went into traveling. What was her name? Bertha Hendricks. Bertha Hendricks was a real inspiration to me at her bookstore as I started pursuing this idea of storytelling and children's authorship. And that led me into the whole thing for about 25 years. So I traveled. I traveled the country, and I traveled outside the country, and I spoke, and I met interesting people, and I studied interesting folklore. And over that period of time, who I was prior to that travel and the seminary training that I had, and who I was after that travel when I came back here and began working here 5.5, 6 years ago, full-time, taking on 1111, that's a different person. And it's been interesting to be here every week, because even working with Charmin and her husband, Dwight, were sort of co-pastors, even in the Church of Christ. Even though women weren't ordained, they very much were co-pastors in the church. And so for years, and some of you who are retired pastors in here or current clergy in here, for years you understand sort of this model of what it means to be a pastor. But that all changed for me when I left the local church to travel and then came back. And all of the understanding that I had in seminary about how to think about Scripture, when I would read this Scripture that Tommy read this morning, I would think about what Jesus was saying, and I would see it as another example of John's Gospel, which was sort of a mystical gospel, of John's Gospel identifying Jesus as divine and no one else getting it. And then in my fundamentalist days, I would be sitting back and thinking about the rest of the world, identifying with Jesus and defending Jesus as my boyfriend and saying, you people don't understand him, right? Because I knew I did. But I don't look at it now. that way. I'm not looking at it anymore from this perspective of this divinely sacred, inspired book, but more from the perspective of the power of story to transform lives in different ways, in different contexts, depending on where we are at the time in our own lives. And in that sense, it is quite magical and profound and truth potentially bearing. And so now I look at the text, and I'm not thinking about what Jesus is doing. I'm always thinking about what's the crowd doing. What are they doing in response? Because here's a guy like a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi or any number of people you know or know of who are doing everything they can to reach out in compassion and help others. And the people around them are scared. And the people around them are angry. Why is that? So I'm looking at what it means to be in the crowd and what it means to live in the midst of the crowd when we're trying to do good and people start looking at us maybe, or people start getting defensive. And how do we even begin to relate when people get ready to pick up metaphorical stones or literal guns? How do we relate to the crowds around us? When I was a kid, growing up in a dysfunctional family, I always thought as I got involved with the Baptist church, I was interested in finding out where God was. I was interested in finding God. And so I pursued the Baptist church, and then I pursued the Pentecostal church for a while, and I pursued the Bible church for a while. And over a period of about 10 to 12 years, I was involved all the way up into mid-college with a fairly evangelical fundamentalist orientation. But the more I got involved, the more crazy people seemed around me. I don't know if I'm stepping on toes in here, because to be quite honest, some of you are crazy too. I mean, it's not like they have the patent on craziness, but they do have it in concentration. And yeah, I spoke in tongues, everybody. I did. I spoke in tongues. I did it a couple of different times, and even that I stopped thinking, because whenever the interpreter would get up to interpret something, I'd have to stop a second and go, is that what you were telling us? Like we didn't already know that? I mean, it was always obvious kinds of things, obvious kinds of affirmations, but the whole experience was what the community was looking for. Subconsciously, that need to emotionally be connected to something. And so you have charisma or charismatics, or you have other kinds of experiential kinds of religion. But all of it to me, because I was a psych major and a philosophy minor and a double in social work, I just looked at them and said, I've worked with you people at the state hospital. Jerry Falwell has a look-alike at the state hospital. He's there. And I began to realize what I was looking for was wrong. But it had been there all along. I just hadn't seen it. And now looking back, I realized what it was I was really looking for. And I'm still looking for. I'm still searching. And I feel so lucky to be in a community like this, to be able to search with you. Because as many of you know in private as we've talked, I say some things I'm pretty convicted of, but I'm just as willing to say, it's what I'm thinking right now. I'm not real sure. I'm still looking. I'm still seeking. Let's do this together and see what we find out. There's plenty of other places to go if you're looking for answers. I think you're wrong, but if there's plenty of places to go. But I realized, because when I was a kid and I grew up in this dysfunctional, broken family with alcoholism and abuse and stuff, I was thinking I was looking for God, but what did I want, right? I wanted the big guy to say I'm loved, right? I wanted the big guy to affirm me. That's what we're doing. That's what we often perceive, what we're often looking for when we come to real honest terms with what we want out of a divine connection. But we find it oftentimes in connections with one another, don't we? As we get more involved in those connections, we find that. What Paul Tillich, the theologian, called the ultimate grace, the ultimate divine grace that we are given, is simply to accept our acceptance. When we can do that, we've begun the road to transformation. But that's really some of the hardest things to do for some of us, to accept our acceptance. So for me, that was part of the journey, was to kind of get there. When I realized that what I was really looking for, all of my young adulthood life, when I volunteered for the Fort Worth Crisis Hotline for a year, and I was doing once a week. I was only 17, and I was once a week doing the midnight shift. But it gave me great training ground for working with crazy people. It really did, in some of these churches that I worked with. Anyway, but and I did that for a year, and it gave me this sense in which I suddenly realized, no, we're all mixed up. We're all messed up. We're all dealing with pain. We're all dealing with suffering. We're all dealing with crises we haven't got a clue of how to deal with. And that became an opportunity to simply just sit there on the phone and to say, well, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just going to hang on here. You hang on with me. And then somebody eventually we could get resources for. And then I worked at the state hospital when I was in college. I worked at the Austin State Hospital, worked on the psych ward. And then when I was graduating, I did my first year out of college, and I worked as the first male family planning counselor at the Austin Planned Parenthood. It was me and 20 women. And I was talking about their family planning. It was a great experience. They had questions I had no idea. Anyway, but it was such... I leapt into this not because I love taking risks. I mean, I do take risks sometimes, but I was looking for something. And I've realized it as I've come into this community. And that's what I want this series to be about, because I realized what I'm really looking at, what I'm really been searching for, and what I think we're all really searching for if we got down to where our faith journeys have taken us and why we're here now. It is, what does it mean to truly be human? What does that really mean to be human? What does that mean in terms of how we relate to ourselves and to one another? So that when we come to this text and we see this text and Jesus is doing these compassionate, amazing things for people, the people around him get scared. He says, I do these things because God's in me, and I'm in God, and I'm God. And wait a minute, you're God too. It says so in your own laws. You're God too. And they start reaching for stones. Why would that be? What is it that they're so afraid of? What in our own culture are people so afraid of when we're down at the border and we're saying, come on, this is cruel? And it's not our current administration. It's been there. I went looking back. Get online, start looking back. It's been administrations prior to this, always dealing with the border issues in a way in which the first priority is not because you're human and we're human and let's see if we can figure this out. The first priority has always been, what does this mean for us? What's going to happen to us when we do this? It's just now we have a culture that's more sort of capitalizing on fear in a way that's more prevalent, probably because we've got a social media that also loves to feed it. And also probably because it's where our brains will go easily, first thing. No matter how enlightened we think we are, our brains will go to fear. It's part of our most ancient DNA and neurobiology. Why do we pick up stones? What are we afraid of? So this past summer, Mike Phillips, who's not here, in fact, none of the people that went with me on this trip are here. Daryl and Laura Parker are out of town this weekend, and his father's not doing well and had a stroke, and he's been in California and then traveling for Lockheed. But Daryl and I and Mike Phillips and Laura and Mike's sister, we went to this thing called the Wild Goose Festival. Some of you might have heard of this thing. It's a very unusual, progressive festival. It's kind of this confluence of people who are at this place in their faith journey where they no longer believe what they used to believe. A lot of them are former evangelicals, several thousand people here. There's a number of people who are agnostic and atheist who are there. There's other religious people that are present there, Buddhists and others. But the primary group are these evangelicals, and most are 30-somethings, and even a little younger, and then some older. But it's gathered around people like Diana Butler Bass, a sociologist and professor, and Brian McLaren, and Richard Rohr has been there. And this past year, Diana Butler-Bass and Brian McLaren and Barbara Brown Taylor, wonderful speaker, preacher, and writer. They were some of the headliners. And then, of course, Marianne Williamson, the presidential candidate, was there. And that was interesting to hear her in the context of this setting. But the whole point of this group is they come together around issues of diversity and inclusiveness and questions, and justice. The priority is sort of like, well, whatever we know, we're not sure of, we're at least sure of one thing, and that is we're here to make the world a better place. We're here to be the best human beings we can be in relation to the world. So a heavy emphasis on the environment, a heavy emphasis on justice, and this past year a heavy emphasis on inclusiveness, because that's what the Methodist Church is still dealing with, and then a heavy emphasis on the environment. So all these things were kind of coming together. And so at the end of it, we get to go listen to this guy who's, I'm going to make sure I can say his name right. Let's see. Here it is. Yes. Bushi Yamato Damashii. Now, Bushi Yamato Damashii is a former Baptist preacher, African-American Baptist preacher in Tennessee, who suddenly in the midst of his, and he's a third generation, somewhere in the midst of his pastoring, he began to realize there's a lot of people in pain. Why doesn't God love them exactly as God would love me? It has less to do with my piety and more to do with the place of grace in all of our lives. And he began to see that there was a place for everyone at the table. Didn't matter who they were, what they were, how they identified themselves. Everyone belonged at the table. And so he began to reach out in the community beyond the walls of his own community and invite people that they were a little uncomfortable with. And they began to pick up stones. And after a few years, they fired him. You can do that in the Baptist church. You can't fire me. You make a big old stink, eventually I might be gone, but it's hard to get rid of me. I have to get rid of myself, which I often dance that fine line. But so he started to look for a way to reach out and to broaden, to find this broader compassion. He began studying with a Buddhist priest in the Mahayana tradition, and he actually, after 6 years, became a Buddhist priest. So he became a black Southern Baptist Buddhist priest. And for the remaining group that stayed in his church, they stayed with him. They saw the bigger picture, the wider boundaries, and so they began to open up their arms and to reach out. And eventually he transformed that church, and he called it the Sangha Bodhi Christo, which means Community of Awakening Christ. And it's still there in Tennessee where his old church used to be. So he was there about to speak, and everybody called him Bushi. And as Bushi was talking, he talked about the Augustinian movement, how it changed what was happening with Jesus into a legalistic kind of Roman Catholic kind of punitive way of understanding our relationship to God. And then he said, but that's not what you find in the Old Testament originally. That's not what you find in the teachings of Jesus. And then he looked at one another and he says, because you see, you've been taught for so long that human was bad, that our purpose was to be something other than who we are, and to deny ourselves in terms of who we are in essence. And he says that's wrong. We're part of the Imago Dei. We were created not just in the image of God, we were created to be God. We are God enfleshed in the world. And he looked in particular at others who you knew had been told the opposite story. You knew they were part of that history. Some of us have been part of that history too. And then he said, so here's what I want you to do. And this is what inspired me. This is what literally turned on a light in my head and began to put all these pieces together that I've just shared with you. He said, what I want you to do is I want you to take your image of God and I want you to set God aside. Now, for a lot of us, that doesn't seem such a big task. For a lot of these evangelicals, it was a major idea. It was almost a heretical idea. And he said, no, I want you to set aside God. If you really think God is what God is, then God's not going anywhere. But I want you to set aside God because you're clinging too tight. So you need to let go and make some room. And you need the room so that you can really see who you are and what you're capable of. And then he said something that I had never thought of. And he said, because if you really want to know who you are spiritually, if you really want to find your best spiritual self, your deepest spiritual self, the only way you're going to get there is to find out who you are deeply as a human. Because that's what we are. We're human. So that's where we're going to begin this series. This series, we're going to take a look at what it means to be human. Because that's the only way we can truly get in touch with what it means. Siri, I did not call you. Okay. That should worry us. Anyway, so I want us to. What I want to do is I want you to join me in this exploration. We're going to take what it means to be human, and I'm going to hit some taboo subjects because the taboo things you don't ever talk about in church are religion, sex, and politics, and I'm going there because that's what it means to be human. Don't expect me to take any particular sides. I'm just going to explore it with you because that's who we are as humans. And that's what we deny when we get into this divisiveness. That's really what we're denying. We're denying our humanity when we get in these places of division. And then we lean on this object that we call God and justify it. And that isn't God. We're God. We're God's image in the world, and we're denying it in order to justify our fears. So we're going to look at what it means to be afraid in politics. We're going to look at what it means to be afraid in sex. We're going to know what it means to be afraid of in our relationships and in our religion and in our finances and in our relationships and in technology even. We're going to take a look at what it means to be truly human in order to find our deeper spirituality. I want to end with this last little story. There's this wonderful poem that you all know. It's one of my favorite poems. Rumi says, this being human, this poem, this being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. And Rumi says, welcome them all. The hard times, let them come. Treat each guest honorably because each one may be clearing you out for some new delight. The shame, the malice, the dark thought. Meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whatever comes because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. How does being human open us up to a deeper spirituality? When I was working my first year out of college at the methadone clinic here in Fort Worth, Miss Legato, little tiny nurse, Italian nurse, probably 60 at the time, been working with it, helped to co-found it, the Texas Education and Medical Foundation. A methadone clinic for heroin addicts. I had 120 people on my caseload. There were 2 of us caseworkers. It was overwhelming. The pain, the extremities of addiction, the extremities of fear, the extreme realities of pain and early suffering that have just become this thick wall of denial buried in addiction, right? And how to break through all of that. And hardly ever did I ever see light. And I remember once going, because I was so naive, I was 22 years old, and most of these people were at least 30 to 60, most of my clients. And I remember going to little Miss Legato, who was just as salty as she was saintly. And she was part of the street mission and Acorn Ministries and whatnot in Fort Worth's early outdoor ministry and urban ministry. And she looked at me, and I said, I don't know that I can handle this anymore. And I'm just overwhelmed. And I described the whole thing to her. And I remember she leaned over and she put her hand on my shoulder, and she just looked me right in the face. And what she said to me reminded me, as I looked back over this last week, I looked back over being ordained after 5 years of seminary, and the bishop laying his hands on my shoulder with 2 or 3 other ministers who had been my peers and family members and 1,500 lay people and clergy in the congregation, and the bishop saying those words, "Take thou authority and preach the gospel." And looking back, Miss Legato's words still are more profound to me, because she looked me in the face and she said, "Kiddo, welcome to the human race." Amen.